the awakening no one applauds. There comes a moment, subtle, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, when you stop shrinking yourself just to make others comfortable. You stop smiling to keep the peace, stop apologizing for feelings you can't suppress, stop bending over backward, hoping someone will finally recognize your worth. It doesn't start with a dramatic explosion. It starts with silence, with distance, with a voice inside you that says, "No more." They'll call it overreacting. They'll say you've changed, that you're being cold, selfish, or too sensitive. But what they're really seeing is your awakening. This is what clarity looks like when it stops asking for permission. This is what it means to finally understand the weight you've been carrying wasn't yours to begin with. For so long, you tried to be the peacemaker, the forgiver, the one who understands. You sat in rooms where your voice was dismissed. You stayed in relationships where your presence was tolerated, not cherished. You explained your pain with patience. You excused patterns with hope. And every time you raised your voice to say this hurts, you were told it's not that bad, that you were imagining it, that your expectations were too high. So you lowered them. You let things slide that should have been addressed. You accepted apologies that never came. You made room for people who never once thought to make room for you. And somewhere in all that accommodation, you began to disappear. Psychologically, this is known as self-abandonment, the chronic habit of silencing your truth to maintain connection. The fear of disconnection becomes so strong, you learn to abandon yourself before anyone else can. But here's the truth no one tells you. When you begin to reclaim your voice, when you start saying no instead of always nodding yes, when you refuse to explain your existence anymore, they will call it an overreaction. Because your boundaries threaten the comfort of their control. Because the version of you they were comfortable with was never whole to begin with. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But becoming yourself isn't always graceful. It's often misunderstood. It's met with resistance from those who benefited from your silence. So when you start showing up differently, not louder, just clearer, don't expect applause. Expect confusion. Expect withdrawal. Expect passive aggression. Expect people who once claimed to love you to look at your healing and call it hostility. But understand this. You are not overreacting. You are responding with clarity. And clarity isn't chaotic. It's just uncomfortable for those committed to misunderstanding you. This new version of you, the one who sees through manipulation, who no longer chases, who no longer doubts their own emotions, isn't too much. It's just finally enough. And as you begin to make decisions from this grounded place, something remarkable happens. Your nervous system stops panicking every time you say no. Your body stops bracing for rejection every time you speak your truth. You stop clinging to crumbs and start demanding full meals because you've remembered you're worthy of more. This isn't anger. This isn't drama. This isn't overreaction. It's emotional sobriety. It's clarity cutting through years of self-denial. But the world rarely celebrates clarity. It challenges it. Because clarity threatens illusion. It threatens dynamics that were never balanced to begin with. So when you stop shrinking and start returning to yourself, it's not just that people pull away. It's that you finally notice who was never really there. There's a certain silence that follows awakening. Not loneliness, but space. Space where there used to be noise. Where manipulation disguised itself as love. Where guilt disguised itself as loyalty. Where chaos was normalized, and where you constantly second-guessed your own intuition. Now that silence feels foreign, because before, you were addicted to proving your goodness, to being agreeable, to being chosen. But let's pause here and ask a question that most avoid. Why did you need to be chosen in the first place? What unresolved emptiness made you tolerate crumbs and call it love? What childhood survival pattern made you believe that your worth had to be earned by being low maintenance, easygoing, or endlessly forgiving? This isn't about blame. It's about recognition. Because until you understand why you kept betraying yourself, you'll always be tempted to call clarity an overreaction. You see, people don't just become emotionally exhausted for no reason. They become exhausted from wearing masks they didn't even know they were wearing. The mask of patience, the mask of strength, the mask of "I'm fine," the mask of holding space for everyone else while no one holds space for you. And eventually, your body keeps the score. You feel it in your nervous system, in the headaches, in the anxiety before phone calls, in the weight of conversations where you know you'll leave feeling unseen again. This is not overreaction. This is your soul asking for truth. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What you're doing now, this change they criticize, is actually just consciousness finally catching up with the roles you were forced to play. You're no longer the caretaker of their comfort. You're no longer the emotional shock absorber. You're no longer the one holding the family together with silence and smiles while your own heart is screaming. And of course, that scares them, because people who benefited from your silence will always see your healing as hostility. But that's not your problem anymore. This is what happens when your boundaries stop apologizing for existing. This is what it looks like to live without chasing peace, because you've become it. And maybe you're feeling the grief right now. Not just grief over others, but grief over who you had to be. The version of you that performed emotional labor just to keep love in the room. The version of you that thought staying silent was noble. But clarity brings grief before it brings peace. Let it come. Let the grief roll in waves. It means you're detoxing from dysfunction. It means you're no longer willing to lie to yourself just to keep the story pretty. It means you're releasing the role of caretaker, rescuer, peacekeeper, and stepping into the role of truth teller, boundary setter, whole human. They might not recognize you anymore, but that's okay. They were only familiar with the version of you that was edited for their comfort. You were never overreacting. You were adapting to survive. And now, you are responding to live. No one tells you that clarity can be this lonely. That becoming real often means becoming invisible to people who only ever loved your mask. But trust this, real love doesn't require self-abandonment. Real peace doesn't ask you to mute your instincts. Real alignment doesn't feel like walking on eggshells. This is not the end of something. This is the beginning of self-belonging. You don't have to explain your healing to those who only listen to defend themselves. You don't have to offer an essay every time you say no more. This season of your life isn't about being understood. It's about being true. They say silence is the loudest scream. But when you've lived a life tiptoeing around everyone else's emotions, silence becomes your most honest language. Not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but because you've realized that your peace is more important than being constantly misunderstood. This isn't withdrawal, it's restoration. When you stop chasing validation, something incredible happens. You begin to see clearly who actually values you and who simply values what you do for them. And that clarity, though painful, is a gift because it separates presence from performance. It reveals who stays when you're no longer bending, apologizing, explaining. And what you discover in that quiet space is powerful. You discover that most people weren't uncomfortable with your pain. They were uncomfortable with your voice. You discover that love, when it's real, doesn't punish authenticity. You discover that your own intuition, the very thing you were taught to suppress, is the wisest voice you'll ever hear. This is where you learn the sacred art of detachment, not as indifference, but as liberation, because you no longer feel compelled to convince anyone of your worth. You no longer need to over-explain your boundaries to those who were never listening. You no longer abandon your own needs in the hope that someone will finally notice your quiet suffering. And something deeper shifts internally. Your nervous system, once wired to anticipate rejection or conflict, begins to relax. You breathe easier. You smile more authentically. You start waking up with less dread and more curiosity. Not because life has become easier, but because your soul has become lighter. You've finally stopped carrying the weight of other people's projections. You begin to realize you were never too emotional. You were emotionally attuned. You were never too much. You were just around people who were too little with their truth. And now that you've stepped into alignment with who you actually are, you're no longer available for roles that require your absence. This clarity doesn't always make you popular. It makes you powerful, because now, you don't beg to be chosen. You don't plead to be understood. You don't barter your peace just to sit at a table where love is conditional. You walk away, not to punish, but to protect what you've spent years trying to reclaim, yourself. And people will feel that shift. They'll feel the absence of your energy, your care, your emotional labor. They'll feel the silence and call it distance. They'll feel the peace in your detachment and call it coldness. But what they're really witnessing is your return to self-respect. You don't need to react to every insult, reply to every dismissal, or engage every argument. That's not avoidance. That's clarity. That's the wisdom of someone who no longer trades peace for proximity. You become unshakable, not because life no longer moves you, but because you are rooted. Rooted in your knowing. Rooted in your truth. Rooted in the profound, life-altering realization that your worth was never tied to their ability to see it. They called it overreacting, but you were just finally responding with clarity. And now, what remains is this. You've cleared the noise. You've shed the masks. You've stopped asking for permission to feel what's real. So what's left is truth. Not the kind of truth that shouts or argues, but the quiet kind. The kind that just is, without needing to convince anyone. The kind that lives in your breath, in your posture, in your silence. This is wholeness, not perfection, not emotional invincibility, but the kind of wholeness that comes from no longer betraying your soul just to keep others comfortable. You no longer confuse love with pain. You no longer see rejection as failure. You no longer romanticize being chosen last. You no longer carry the shame of outgrowing people who never really saw you. Instead, you begin to walk differently. You begin to speak differently. You begin to choose differently, not out of fear, but out of alignment. You don't chase peace anymore. You embody it. And here's the part they never told you. When you reclaim yourself, when you stop over-explaining and start protecting your energy, some people will fall away. Let them. Let them fall away without guilt. Let them go without shrinking. Because this version of you, the one who no longer filters your truth through someone else's comfort, is not here to be tolerated. You're here to be respected, to be aligned, and above all, to be free. Freedom isn't just the absence of control. It's the presence of self-trust. It's waking up and trusting your intuition before checking your notifications. It's making choices based on your values, not their expectations. It's saying no without writing an essay. It's resting without guilt. It's loving without abandoning yourself. That's what healing clarity looks like. And yes, this journey gets lonely. Yes, there will be nights when you question everything. Yes, you'll be tempted to go back to the old version of you, the agreeable one, the peacemaker, the person who accepted too little just to feel something. But don't, because that version of you didn't just cost you energy, it cost you your truth. And truth is your most sacred currency. Carl Jung wrote, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." And that's what this is. An awakening to your voice, to your body, to your limits, to your deepest knowing. You were never too sensitive. You were sensing too much. You were never unstable. You were just unsafe. You were never dramatic. You were just finally awake. So the next time they say you're overreacting, you'll smile, not to agree, but to remind yourself. You don't need to be understood to be valid. You don't need approval to trust your gut. You don't need applause to walk away from what dishonors you. Because what they call too much is exactly what finally made you whole. If this spoke to something deep inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment your truth. Subscribe for more insight like this, because your clarity deserves to be surrounded by truth, not noise. You're not overreacting. You're finally responding with clarity.